text file. I know everybody posted their discussion about what data would be stored in a text file and gave a great example. A couple of you and then did your example of an array. And a couple of you, I had some changes to be made, so if you don't mind going back and making sure that I didn't make some comments to your discussion post, and if I suggested some changes, go ahead and make those changes. And if you don't understand these suggestions that I made, feel free to post a question and I'll answer it. I want you to make sure that you understand what is happening when we read these text files and populate these arrays and declare these arrays before we start moving forward, because this is going to be the foundation for moving forward. Each week is going to build on the previous week. So I'm just going to do a simple example of creating an array, creating a text file, and then reading in. And I'm going to use the example of the strings because the strings was what tripped you guys up the most. And understandably, we don't think about it as adults because, well, I mean, as humans, because it's just second nature to read in strings, and you just put a name as a name. But you have to just start thinking as a compiler and thinking dumb. I mean, you really have to start thinking simply and how the system is going to read in that data format and parse it. So I've set up my simple program. Again, it's the same one that I used earlier. I just changed my array to now hold strings. I changed the name to student names. I set the limit to 100. And again, so you notice one of you has done this, and it brings up a very good point. Normally on variable declarations, you can declare your variable and initialize it in the same line. The only time that you cannot do that is in an array declaration. And here's why. Because when we declare an array, we're declaring the array with the number of elements. So I'm declaring my array with 100 elements. But I technically don't have an element at number 100. So if I initialize this at the same line and say equals some string here, temp name, I'm going to get an error because I don't have an element at position 100. The compiler is going to read this and say string student names 100. So don't assign your array a value. You can assign and initialize the entire array. That's using the curly brackets, and that will initialize all the elements in the array instead of just one specific element in the array. So I can start populating, well, the string. So I have to use a string and populate my array with strings. As soon as I hit comma and then another comma, it's going to populate my array with zeros. The rest of my array with zeros. So you can initialize your array that way using the curly brackets, but you cannot initialize your array with just like you do a normal string or like you do a normal single element in your array. Does that make sense? So if I have my array here, I'm going to hold 100 elements. Downloaded this per Ryan's suggestion. So what this does is it goes to memory and it finds memory big enough to hold 100 concurrent string elements. And it gives it the name. I'm going to try to do this with my mouse. So here it's holding 100 strings. So however many bytes a string is, I think it's 8 bytes, or it's going to hold 100. So this is at element 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. So here I've also declared, oh, here we go. So now I have my data file, my text file that you guys all did an example of. I've changed my text file a little bit. So now I'm holding student names. So I changed it from holding integer of ages to now holding strings of student names. So a couple of you had used student names as examples, or names of superheroes, or names of record albums, or names of foods, or names of animals, which is perfectly fine. You can hold whatever you want to in a text file, but you need to be careful because this is only going to read in until it finds a space. So the file input stream is space delimited. So it reads characters until it finds a space and it stops reading. So it's only going to read one string into this variable, and then it's going to stop. So if you want two names to be held in one string variable, then you need to either use the getline, which we'll talk about later, or put two strings, concatenate them together. But the text file input stream is only going to read a string until it hits a space, which is good because you don't want it to read the entire text file. I mean, if you have a name and then an age and then a GPA, you know, you don't want it to read John Doe 34. So it needs to know when to stop reading. And the compiler doesn't know what it's reading. It doesn't know that it's reading an age or a name and then an age and then a GPA. It just knows that it's reading characters, and then it sees an integer, and then it sees a double. So if you look at it like the compiler sees it, as it's just reading characters. So for all comparison purposes, I could have this and this as my name. That's what the compiler sees. It's just reading characters. It could care less if it's the most important name to you, the least important name, if it's the Queen of England's name. It doesn't matter. It's just reading what it sees. So if it needs to be capitalized and it's not, you need to capitalize it. If it needs to be put together and it's not, then you need to put it together. If it needs to be read as one string and it's not, you need to read it as one string. But the compiler and the system reads string, stops at a space, string, stops at a space, next, whatever's in your file, stops at the space, so that it knows how to read and parse the file. Does that make a little bit of sense? Okay, so in my file, so this again, so I open my file. I actually should put this above here so that all my variable declarations are together. So I open my data file, and then if I open it and it's successful and it opens correctly and it's sitting there waiting for me to read it, then I will test it. And if I read in the first string and if it is not the end of file character, then I know that there's actually data in my file. So I will read in while there's actual valid data and not end of file, and I'll fill my array. So sometimes students will put like a temporary variable here and then put their temporary variable into their array. You can do that, that's fine, but you're just wasting space and taking up an extra variable. So what I mean by that is temp name, so I'm going to read in my temp name. If I'm not at the end of file, so if temp name is not end of file character, then my student name sub I is equal to temp name. And then I increment my I. And then I read in my temp name again, and I continue on my loop. So basically what they're doing is declaring another string, filling that with whatever they read in. If it's not the end of file, then they move that to the array. And then they read in again. If it's not end of file, they move that to the array. That's fine, that works, but it's just wasting an extra memory space, and it's wasting an extra read in and move or execution step when you can read directly into the array. So what I would do is just read directly into the array. Start your I off at 1. Read into the first element of your array. Oops, right up here. And that way, if it is the end of file, you read in. So X is then you just don't print it. So this should work. and it prints out my text file in the reverse order. Oops, I didn't save this, did I? So my new text file, oops, I guess I should delete that and then save it. Save that. And then run it again, and then you see it's printing out my text file in the opposite order. As my for loop shows, I'm going from 0, incrementing my I, and then whatever I ends up to be. So I'm incrementing my I from 0. I read in the next student name, increment my I to 1, read in my next student name, and increment my I to 2, 3, 4, so on and so forth. So my I may end up being 11. I come out, I go to my for loop. If I start at 11, because my I had to increment one time to make my loop false, I need to decrement my I. So there may be 10 elements in my array, so I need to decrement my I and start from there, and then I print out my array backwards. And it should print my array in the opposite order. And you notice that it's printing one